Hello, BookTube. I've got a tag today. This is the Read Smart tag. I was tagged by Jay Shea, and I'll leave a link to his channel in the description down below. And I'll also put all the questions in the description down below. So, question one: what is your strategy to stay focused and engaged while reading? Um, I don't have a good answer for this one. I don't really have a strategy, although staying focused is an ongoing problem I have. Uh, I am one of those readers who very often will get to an end of a paragraph and then realize that I've been thinking about something else instead of thinking about the paragraph. Like my eyes have been going over the words, but my brain has not been taking them in. And the only thing I do is just go back and read that paragraph over again. Sometimes I have to read a paragraph two or three or four times. Now, obviously, this depends on the nature of what I'm reading. So, if I'm really reading a thriller where it's something really gripping, then I don't have any problems focusing at all. But if I'm reading something a little bit more dry, this happens to me all the time. Um, Number two, how does your environment influence your focus, and what can you do to optimize it? So I'm at a period in my life now, working three jobs, two young kids, doing a bunch of other things in my life. I don't really have the luxury of being picky about where I read. If I've got some free time, I just open a book. So I get reading done while I'm waiting in line at the cafeteria at work, and then if I'm not eating with anyone in particular, I'll get reading done while I'm eating in the cafeteria at work with all the noise around it. And it's not ideal. Sometimes I do have trouble concentrating, but well, for one thing, time is a luxury. I don't have time to wait for the perfect time to read a book. For another thing, I want to believe that if I struggle to focus on a book in a distracting environment, then maybe that will improve my powers of focus in the long run. Like it'll improve my ability to tune out the distraction and zero in on the words. Although I'm into middle age now, and I'm still struggling with it. So I don't know how much progress I've made on this in my life, but I like to think that it's a worthy struggle. Number three, what methods do you use to retain and recall information from what you've read? Well, it depends a little bit what I'm reading. But for the most part, I'm not a student anymore, or at least I'm not taking any courses right now. I'm not reading for the test. I do read a lot of for professional development, or at least I used to, and I'll come around to that question a little bit later. That's coming up in question number 6. But for the most part, I figure I read, I do my best to pay attention to everything, and I'll remember what I'll remember. And Yeah, I don't put a special emphasis on trying to remember and recall all the information. I would like to, and I do sometimes bemoan the fact that I spent so much time reading to try and improve my mind, and I can only remember a small fraction of what I've read. But I don't really have any techniques that I use. Number 4, how do you approach difficult or challenging material? Well, yeah. There have been a few challenging books I've read while I've had this BookTube channel. In fact, one of those books is right over here, Chomsky's Universal Grammar. This was a very difficult book for me. And there have been a couple other books similar to this. What I've done what I did with this book is I tried to just approach it slowly and carefully. If I got to a paragraph I didn't understand, I'd go back and reread it. If I still didn't understand it, I tried to underline what exactly I didn't understand and make a note in the margins about what was confusing me, like was it the how, was it the why, was it the what part of the sentence was I going wrong in exactly. But in this book, and as a couple other books, as I got further and further along in the book, I was just understanding less and less, to the point where I get to the bottom of a whole page and I realized I didn't understand any of it. And I was very close to giving up on the book, and maybe I should have given up on the book. Maybe that would have been the wiser course of action. But I plowed on through anyways. There were some pages where I understood a little bit, and I was doing this with the intent that this would maybe try and improve my brain in the long run. I don't know if it did. Maybe the best strategy with a book like that is just to ditch it and just to go to something easier and try and build your way up. The problem, though, with this book, as I mentioned in my review of this book, is that this was sitting on my shelf for years. And I kept trying to find intermediate books to work my way up to it. And I was reading other grammar books and other books on linguistics, and I never quite found the bridge to get to this book. And eventually I just thought, I want to read this book, pure stubbornness at that point. So, I mean, ideally, I would say, and I picked this advice up from Steve Donahue. Steve Donahue said there are levels in reading. So you've got to start with the easy stuff and work your way up. But unless you have a clear roadmap of what that ladder is for a particular subject area, it can be a little bit difficult. I also was watching Jared Henderson's channel. I think he was talking about how to read philosophy books. And he was saying in his book, sometimes you just have to read it through once, let it wash over you. Don't worry about understanding every little detail. Just get the overall thrust of the book and then go back in and attack it for the detail. And I've taken that advice in part. I've taken the first part of it. Just try and understand the general thrust of the book and don't worry about understanding every little detail. And then I don't commonly go back and reread it immediately. But I do have this idea that I'd like to start doing more rereading in general. Maybe this gets a little bit into some of these questions. I've heard a few different people mention this on BookTube or on reading advice channels, and this is true for me as well. I used to have the idea that you would read a classic, you would tackle it, and then you had read that classic, and you didn't need to come back to it again. That was on your finished list, and then the classics you haven't read are the ones to go for next. But I've come to realize that the human brain doesn't work that way. The classics need revisiting about once every 10 years, once every 20 years, or something like that, or they just will fade from your memory. So I'm trying to work in more rereading in my schedule now, and maybe that's another way that I'm trying to approach difficult or challenging material, is just say, well, maybe I'll come back and reread it again in another 5 or 10 years. Number 5, what role do note-taking and annotation play in your reading process? Less now than they used to. And this shift has largely been with my reviewing process. So before I got on to BookTube, I was reviewing books on my blog for years. And I started off writing very simple reviews. But then the more I got into it, the more I would approach each book with a mind about how I was going to review it. And I'd be reading through it, and I think to myself, oh, that's a little interesting tidbit. I'll have to remember to talk about that in my review. And then you get to the end of the book and you can't remember half the things you meant to talk about in your review, or the things that you do remember, you can't find anymore. You're like, oh, I know it was somewhere in this chapter, or I feel it was up on the top left-hand corner of one of these pages, but I can't find it. That happened to me too many times. So I just got into the habit of anything that I found was noteworthy of the book, I would underline it, fold down the page if it was my own copy. I mean, obviously not if it was a borrowed book or a library copy. Fold down the page, and maybe even make a note in the margins about why I thought this was interesting. But I've stopped doing that now because I've largely gotten away from written reviews. I've decided at this point in my life I'm too busy to write long written reviews of everything I read, and so I've switched over primarily to video reviews, which take me less time. I know I give long-winded reviews of everything I read, but to write something down just takes hours. To talk to the camera, you talk to the camera for 30 or 40 minutes, and then that you're done with it. At least that's the way I do it. So because of that, I've shifted away to thinking more about the book more holistically instead of trying to note down the interesting stuff on every page. And again, I tell myself, maybe I'll come back and reread it in 5 or 10 years, but for now, this is how I'm going to process the book. All right, number 6. How do you balance reading for pleasure with reading for personal or professional development? So this one is an interesting question for me. I am the only booktuber that I know of that reviews books for professional development on my channel. I'm sure other people do it, but I don't know of any other channels. Let me know something that I'm missing. But I work as an English teacher, and I used to make a point of reading for professional development. One book every month for professional development. So books about English grammar, books about teaching methodology, books about second language learning. And if you go back to the early days of this channel, you'll see in the beginning a book a month related to professional development. My life has changed, though, since I began this channel. When I began this channel, I didn't have any kids. And now my reading time is very limited. And last year, I think I read 3 books for professional development. This year, I'm not sure if I'm going to read any. What I am doing, though, they said personal or professional development. So I guess personal development is I'm trying to take up Steve Donahue's challenge of reading the Western canon, which is what I'm doing with this book, Classical Tragedy, Greek and Roman. So I mean, this is personal development in the sense that, I don't know, it's the classics. Although I am enjoying it as well. If you get these plays in a good modern translation, it's not necessarily all work and no play. They're interesting to read. And I'm not sure I have a system for how I balance it. I used to, and again, this was before kids. I used to try and have like a certain amount of books that I was reading at any one time. So one for professional development, one kind of classic book, one nonfiction book not related to professional development, just in my interests, which are largely history, and one just kind of trashy book, garbage type book, pulp fiction or whatever. But Yeah, that system I've had to abandon since having kids. I can only balance a few books at any one time, a couple books at any one time. Number 7. What is the importance of setting reading goals? Well, yeah, I don't know. Um, I do have reading goals. At the moment, my goal is 200 pages a week, which I almost never make. So if you go to my weekly reading vlogs from this year, 2024, I have a list of the page numbers I've read for this week, the number of pages I've read for this week. And next to that, I have the goal is 200 pages. And I think for all but a couple weeks this year, I've been less than 200 pages. I think most of the time I'm about 130 pages or 120 pages, somewhere around there. Now, I do acknowledge that it's a little bit silly to do page numbers because some of these books have very big print and very wide margins and very few words per page. And some of these books have a lot of words per page. Like, yeah, let me grab one here. Currently trying to read through the Bible as one of my reading projects, and this is a lot of words per page. It's much different than, but your standard paperback. So to a certain extent, page numbers are a little bit silly, but what are you gonna do? Like, I'm not gonna actually count the number of words I've read. Although people who read off Kindles or something like that, I'm sure there must be a feature to do that, huh? But I read paper books, so I count the number of pages. I don't count the words. But that wasn't the question. The question wasn't what is your reading goal. The question was the importance of setting reading goals. I have a reading goal, but I'll be honest, there are times when I question the wisdom of that reading goal. So, and those of you who have reading goals, I'm sure can identify with this immediately. The goal is 200 pages or whatever the page numbers are. And you start sitting down to read, and you become more concerned with turning those pages than you become concerned with getting enjoyment out of what you're reading, focusing deeply on what you're reading. The desire to keep turning those pages is always overshadowing that reading experience. And I try to guard against this, but I think there is the temptation to occasionally turn the page when you really should go back and focus more on that page before you turn it over, especially when you're reading something difficult or something that deep, something that merits more analysis. So I don't do this, but I should. I think what I should do is have a reading goal of an amount of time. Something I heard on BookTube, which makes sense to me, is 40 minutes a day. 40 minutes a day of quiet, uninterrupted reading. Now, that would be difficult for me to do at this stage in my life, to have 40 minutes all to myself just for reading. I think it would be more beneficial to make reading a habit, something that's actually scheduled into your day, than it is to have a page count goal or a number of books goal. I don't do it, but I probably should. All right, and number 8. What are some strategies for overcoming reading slumps or lack of motivation? My usual strategy when I find myself getting into a reading slump, usually the reason I've gotten into that reading slump is because I'm reading something I don't enjoy. So when I find myself getting into that reading slump, what I usually try and do is just get something that's enjoyable, but is not might not be a classic. You know, my sweet spot is kind of fantasy. So I'll look for like a pulpy type fantasy book. Something that's cheap and on the bookshelves and looks like it's just trash, but would be enjoyable. The difficulty with this, though, I find, is sometimes finding an enjoyable book can be more difficult than it seems. So sometimes I have this idea that I'll just get a lowbrow book and it'll be really enjoyable just because it's trash. But, sometimes those trashy books are actually a bit of a chore to read through because they're not well written. Maybe what I should be doing is finding a really good classic. I don't know. The other strategy I have, I guess, I do weekly reading vlogs on this channel. So every week I report on my reading. And if you've been watching those weekly reading vlogs, maybe you're able to guess this already. There are some weeks where my heart is not in it, where I am purely doing it just to maintain the habit. Those are usually weeks when I'm filming past my bedtime and it's been a busy day. I just don't have a lot of time and I feel tired. And I do occasionally think to myself, maybe I should just let this go. But at the same time, that does create a certain amount of accountability that keeps me reading. So whatever books I'm reading, whatever my projects are for that week, I do not want to come to the weekly reading vlog and say, I've read 0 pages this week. Even if it's only like 4 pages or, 2 pages out of this book. I feel like I have to at least get those done before turning on the weekly reading vlog. So I can say I've read something from this book. And that keeps me from going completely without reading for any given week. I may go for some days without reading, but the fear of having to admit that I've read nothing from a certain book all week will at least get me a few pages in before the weekly reading vlog. So that's one of the reasons I keep that weekly reading vlog going. Okay, so tagging. I'm going to tag some people here. William over at William's Library. Kelsey Heckman, who I'm not sure if his channel is still active or not. But Kelsey, if you are looking for an excuse to get back into it, consider yourself tagged. Kelly at Books I'm Not Reading. Mindy over at Mindy's Book Journey. Joseph Francis Burton. And Bucky749. Please consider all of yourselves tagged for this if you haven't done it already. And thank you very much, BookTube. I will see you next time.